disappeared, everything would collapse into chaos. Without pollinators, we wouldn't have a lot of the foods that we eat now, of course. They're a vital part of this whole cycle that we depend on for good food. I'm Brian Fredericksen, as she mentioned, from Ames Farm. We keep 550 beehives in central Minnesota. I like to call myself more of a collector and a forager. I don't make honey, I collect the honey that the bees make. So honeybees, that's what I work with. The term bees is tossed around a lot right now in the media. And there are somewhere around 300 or 400 native pollinators that we have in the Midwest and across the United States. So it's honeybees that I'm speaking of today. And for the most part, those are managed by humans. They were brought by European immigrants in the 1600s, and we keep them in a way kind of like farmers keep livestock. I know how many hives I have. The bees fly back to those boxes. In a hive of bees, I'm sure you've heard of queen bees. There is one queen bee in each hive. She can lay up to 1,000 eggs a day. The workers are all unfertilized females. They do all the work. Anybody want to venture or guess what the male bees do? Nothing. They're there for one thing. The rest of us dudes, we know what that is. Should that occur, if there's a virgin queen that needs to be mated, the drones are there. But it's the workers, the unfertilized females, that are doing all the work. That queen, as I mentioned, can lay up to 1,000 eggs a day. That means 23 days later, 1,000 worker bees are hatching out. So what we do as keepers of the bees is we help the bees grow, especially in the spring, to get to a large population. They're collecting honey during that time for food, but we need to get them to a bigger population so that they can collect extra honey. And that's what beekeeping is about. Those workers only live for 6 weeks in the summer, and they're dead. So that queen is constantly raising new bees to replace those. Hopefully, if the hive is managed right, those that are hatching out, the population will be increasing rather than decreasing. Now in late summer, early fall, that population is slowly going to dwindle, and then the whole cycle starts all over again. Plant sex. All living things want to reproduce, want to leave the next generation. Things like grass and corn are wind pollinated. So there's enough of the pollen flying around in the air that it falls into the other flowers. The whole reproduction cycle is completed, and that plant gives seed. With other plants that aren't wind pollinated, some of them are super showy. Big, colorful looking flower that attracts a pollinator. Some of the other ones, though, don't have such a showy flower, and they need to attract the pollinators, and what they do is they offer up nectar. Believe it or not, some of the flowers you see in gardens and things like that, the big lilies, stuff like that, they don't give any nectar that our honeybees have an interest in. A lot of our bees are looking at like sweet clover. It's just a tiny white little flower. So how bees get involved in this plant sex is foragers, those worker bees I was talking about that are unfertilized females, at different times in their life they have different jobs. The first couple weeks they're nurse bees and they take care of baby bees and larvae in there, and then they start foraging, and they might bring in water, pollen, or nectar. And when they go into a hive to collect pollen, they get some of that pollen on their furry body. And when they fly into another flower, that pollen gets transferred inadvertently to that flower, and that's when that pollination occurs. The same thing if a bee is flying into a flower, they're going to sip a little bit of nectar out, maybe they don't get enough, they bop over to another flower. They're also pollinated because when they enter that flower, that pollen on the side of their legs and their body then gets transferred. So they're sort of like accidentally involved in this whole thing of plant sex. The food that we get out of that, I do collect bee pollen and it's sold for its nutritional value. It's actually kind of interesting to use, in the kitchen, like to put on a salad things like that. It has different flavors. But honey and bee pollen, in a way, is a byproduct of this pollination that the bees are doing for all these plants. So honey is nectar. It's not somehow, I see this a lot in the media, somehow bees turn pollen, which is a hard, a physical substance, into liquid. It's probably not very likely. I don't know, any plant that can turn a solid to liquid. But they drink in the nectar and they bring that back into the hive and they regurgitate that into the comb. They have two stomachs, one for carrying the nectar and one for eating. When I bought my little orchard, it'll be 20 years ago this coming November, a couple of beehives came with it. I was scared of the bees. I mean, probably no different than many people are. And I gained a respect for them as time went on, and some skills. And I realized early into this, I was sampling honey throughout the summer, that there are different flavors and colors and so on, and qualities. And I realized, here in the Midwest, the dandelions are some of the first flowers, and then you see that wave of fruit trees and other plants that flower. That's a progression of food that's available. And like this year in Minnesota, we had a ridiculous amount of rain. It was cool. This season was different. It's going to be different than next year and the year after that. Some of these seasons favor certain plants and unfavor others. For instance, basswood is a tree that we could sometimes make a third or half of our honey crop from. Those trees didn't have any blossoms this year. Second time in 20 years. I also grow apples. A lot of my apple trees were not blooming this year as a result of a drought we had last fall and that really long winter. So my point sort of is honey depends so much on the weather, the soils in an area like wine and other fruit and crops like that taste unique to some part of the world, and certainly the weather. I live and die by the weather. I'm constantly checking the weather. I can tell you what the weather was in the summer of 2009 in July. So I came up with this. It took me a while. I was thinking, how can I capture and sell what the bees are doing? And the definition I came up with was single source honey. Honey from one location, one hive, and one time period. Because when you put that hive of bees down, if you put them along the Lake Michigan coast here, or inland, or up in Minnesota, and they sit there for 5 months, they're taking a floral snapshot of that area. And that snapshot includes those variables I talked about, the soil, the weather, and it even involves the strength of that hive. If it's a boomer hive, the bees are just like us. There's all different sizes of us here and different traits that we have. You can breed bees for certain traits that you like. If you have a hive of bees that's calm, makes a lot of honey, I can make more queens from her and have more of those bees in my hive. But my point is that each hive is very individual, like we are. And the honey that they're going to produce is going to be different. If it's a really strong hive or a really weak hive, they have different foraging abilities. So this idea of single source honey that I sell, each jar has that location on it, the hive number, and then there's a letter after that, A, B, C, D. And those are for each 34-pound box of combs that we make honey in. I package that 34 pounds. So when you get one of our jars, you can follow that back to that place, that hive, and that time period. Now, some of those are true to a flower, like basswood or sweet clover or dandelions. Some of them have more of a collection of flowers, depending if they collected it in a week, when we get a lot of nectar coming in, or sometimes like this summer it was a trickle of nectar. It's more of a collection, like prairie flowers or wildflowers. The honey that you see at most of the big box, Walmart, grocery stores and stuff like that doesn't have that same origin. It may be collected in many areas by many hives. About 65% of the honey consumed in this country comes from overseas. China and Argentina are big honey producers. You have robots milking cows now. We have these huge pieces of farm equipment. But beekeeping, it's still some dude or some woman with a suit and a hand tool. It's very labor intensive. And that's why a lot of honey production has moved outside the US and North America, because it's labor intensive. So if you buy a squeeze container of honey from a big packer, there's a very good chance that may not be American honey. And most of those plastic squeeze containers are liquid year-round. That's not the way honey sort of looks in a beehive. Raw honey, when you collect it, is liquid. If you don't heat it, when it's exposed to temperatures around 53 Fahrenheit, it will solidify. So if I'm talking to a farmer's market customer in Minneapolis that's from Africa or South America, they may not, and they've recently moved here to the United States, they've never seen a crystallized jar of honey perhaps because it's warm there year-round. But raw honey has medicinal properties. There's just some brand new research out in the last few weeks from Norway. It's been published mostly in the England newspapers that shows 13 different lactic acids that have antibacterial properties. And the study said that these are more powerful than antibiotics because there's 13 of these different compounds that can work against different bacteria rather than one antibiotic that's sort of focused, on one type of maybe disease or problem that you have at the moment. So the point there is raw honey is, besides coming as a byproduct of this reproductive cycle of plants, it's got truly medicinal properties. If you buy local honey to you that's raw and you have allergies, you can get rid of your medications. It's the same concept as a vaccine exposes you to a low dose all the time of that virus. You're exposing yourself to these pollens that are caught making you uncomfortable. Now my honey from Minneapolis isn't going to help you with allergies here, but my pitch is for all beekeepers and honey. There's room for all of us out there. So that processed honey, back to the squeeze containers, that's a convenience issue. It's not a safety issue. It's, hey, check it out, liquid honey year-round. Big difference. Sure. Good question. She brought up Tupelo honey. Now that's a tree that's in the swamps of places like Florida. I think Mississippi produces a little bit in the areas down there. The sugar structure of that honey is unique. Acacia honey found in Europe is similar, and that will not crystallize very fast. Our dandelion honey up here in the upper Midwest, I've had that crystallize in the comb. It wants to crystallize. There's some chemistry involved there. That's a little bit out of my area, but that's the difference. Some of the other forms of honey that you've probably seen is the edible pieces of comb. I think I am maybe the largest producer, at least in the upper Midwest, of comb. But this year was not a good year. We need to have a huge amount of nectar coming in. See, what happens is beeswax is something that bees that have just hatched out, the nurse bees I mentioned before, actually exude from their body. It's really interesting. Other bees pick this wax off of them and build that honeycomb to put the honey in. It's like nature's way of, quick, there's some food coming in, we need to build a structure here to hold it. So when you make edible comb like that, it's wax that was made almost simultaneously as the honey comes in. So we have these combs that have wires in that are 30, 20 years old that I spin the honey out of. You wouldn't want to eat that comb because it's tough. It's 5, 10, 20 years old. You want that cut comb where we hung a piece of like almost toilet paper tissue, thin beeswax as a starter sheet, and then the bees draw that out and fill it with honey. So when I mentioned before how special my single source honey is, a 34-pound box that as a floral snapshot of like a 2-week period. That comb honey is a 4-inch square. Now we're down to days, even hours. I've seen them fill a box of honey in a few days when the nectar is just so heavy you could shake it out of the flowers. So that's why comb honey is so special, because you're dealing with a really small amount of time that the bees brought this nectar in. It's like the most ultimate single source honey. I mean, what I'm doing is, other people can do this. You know, it's a principle, it's the way that you approach beekeeping. But also in that honeycomb, when you expose honey to the air, some of my honeys have these little nuances of flavor. It's like you go to the farmer's market, and you get some fresh vegetables or some cheese or other fresh meat, and there's just qualities to that you'd have a hard time explaining to someone. It's just so good, right? These little aromas and things like that. So comb honey is special in that it's sealed in that comb until the moment that you eat it. I wish I had a lot to sell you. Stick with me in Fortune. Better days will come. I want to end with, there's a lot of talk about the bees are dying and so on. We have industrial beekeepers, feedlot beekeepers, just like we do dairy and pork and poultry. A lot of bees, 1.5 million colonies out of the 2.3 million in this country are going to be in California for almond pollination. If you have a fruit tree in your yard and you don't have honeybees, you'll probably still get some apples, but without bees, the almonds can lose 65% of their crop. So when you're moving bees out there and you're getting paid $150 a hive to leave them there for 2 weeks for pollinating almonds, suddenly the economics of this is way different than just making honey. So that's changed the nature of beekeeping in this country. And for some beekeepers, they're in it for the pollination right now, and that has taken away some of the honey production in this country. But I want to just briefly mention, I would say a lot of the media reports on honeybees in general are inaccurate. If any of you are on Twitter, Facebook, today I just uploaded 2 new graphs on my Twitter feed. It's Ames Farm Honey, Twitter. You'll see some graphs there from the United Nations and USDA. It shows the number of beehives like this in the world, and in the United States is flat. I'm not saying we don't have issues with habitat and things like that, but we don't have a death spiral of honeybees. If anything, the attention on honeybees has been good because it's getting land managers, policymakers, and homeowners thinking about what you can do, and you can do a lot. Mowed lawns, cornfields, there's nothing there for the bees. Leaving those ditches mowed until the end of August, planting some stuff on your land and leaving it bloom, and a diversity of food. Bees and pollinators need hundreds of different sources of food. They don't just eat clover, or we don't just eat cornflakes or bread. We need different sources of food and nutrition. So I want to just leave you with that thought that the world of pollinators is okay for now. Let's just say, I think the attention in the media, a lot of it gets a little crazy about different topics, should be more of a bellwether of, hey, we have some issues out of there. We should be thinking about the pollinators when we develop farm policy, land use policies here in cities, and I see that happening all